Hero of the U.S. Navy's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron is Lieutenant Commander Bulkley, here with a pretty sponsor to send more of the tiny warships into service. A newer model now and twice as deadly. The young commander goes aboard to test the new craft as only he and the few who came back know how. Well do they remember the thrilling news headlines of yesterday. Bulkley and his torpedo boats strike the Japs. An aircraft carrier, a tanker, 2 cruisers, landing barges, destroyers, and bombers blasted to bits. Sinking 100 times their own tonnage, Bulkley's outnumbered squadron wrote naval history in the China Sea.
Moviegoers in 1942, after viewing this newsreel account, might have come to the conclusion that PT boats could single-handedly win the war in the Pacific. That Americans were willing to believe such exaggerated claims seems almost silly now. But during the early days of World War II, while the Navy struggled to recover from Pearl Harbor, the country needed something to cheer about. PT boats came to symbolize the American ideal of fighting back and winning against the odds. By war's end, the exploits of PTs and their crews had achieved a legendary, almost mythical status. But in the 60 years that have passed since, the role they played has been largely forgotten. In 1992, a group of World War II veterans from the Northwest set out to change that, beginning an unlikely journey that would take them from Portland, Oregon to Oakland, California, and over 60 years into the past. There in the waters of San Francisco Bay sat Patrol Torpedo Boat 658. Neglected, sun-damaged, and listing badly on its mooring, PT 658 was but a shell of the proud fighting ship she had once been. Yet the veterans had the vision and the inspiration to see beyond the rotted deck and broken mast of the 658. They dreamed of a fully restored, sleek warship plying the waters of the Willamette and Columbia rivers.
And the reasons for which we are doing it are kind of twofold. One is for the historical purposes, to maintain and preserve a boat that fought in a very important war. And the second part of it is the educational portion, so that the youngsters of today can go aboard a PT boat that has engines in it, that'll be running, that'll be the way it was 55, 60 years ago. And that's important.
In World War II, the U.S. Navy played a vital role in winning the peace. The destroyers, carriers, and battleships of the Navy may be better known, but for the men who served aboard them, perhaps the most venerated vessels of the war are the Motor Patrol Torpedo Boats, or PTs.
The first time I got on board, I don't think I ever felt that way in my life before or after. It was a great sense of speed, and on a PT boat, you're right there. It's like being in a little sports car. You get the sense of the ocean, the speed, the spray's coming over, your armament's right there. It's hard to describe. It really is. It's a hell of an adventure. As a matter of fact, I'm looking forward to doing it again once more with this boat of ours. We all are. Let's hear those 3 Packards turn over one more time, at flank speed if we can, and bring back a lot of good memories. We'll never recapture our youth, but some part of it we will.
When most people think of these small warships today, they recall images of General MacArthur evacuating the Philippines on a PT boat, or the dramatic and heroic events following the sinking of JFK's PT-109 by a Japanese destroyer. Little is understood about the contribution these small craft made to the war effort. American-made PT boats served in every theater of operations during the war, including the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and the Aleutian Islands. But it was in the Philippines and the South Pacific that PTs made their greatest impact.
By its nature, shallow draft, relatively short range, the PT boat isn't built for combat in the open ocean. It's built for warfare along coasts, along islands, in archipelagos, in inshore waters, in sounds. So the principal mission of U.S. PT boats in the Pacific in World War II was to raid Japanese shipping. Their main target wasn't Japanese warships. It was the Japanese ships and barges that carried supplies between islands. By cutting off these supplies, and the campaign was very successful, they could prevent the Japanese army from reinforcing the islands.
PT boats were stationed at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and were credited with downing at least one Japanese aircraft. In the Philippines during the early days of the war, the 6 boats of PT Squadron 3 fought a heroic delaying action against the Japanese. Squadron 3's commander, John Bulkley, received the Medal of Honor for evacuating General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor. More than 700 American PTs were constructed before the war ended, and while their accomplishments were limited, the contributions these small boats made to the war effort are undeniable. It was that place in history that the Portland veterans set out to preserve. Their goal was to restore a PT boat to its original running condition, complete with torpedoes, depth charges, and guns. But finding a suitable candidate would prove difficult. When the war ended, the U.S. Navy had little use for its fleet of small craft that, like all wooden boats, required constant maintenance. Consequently, an order went out to beach, strip, and destroy any boat that failed a structural inspection. More than 120 were burned in the Philippines alone.
They took the radios and the stuff off of them and the guns, and they scrapped them. Put them up on the beach and set them afire. And I thought that was a tragic mistake. I think they'd been better off to turn them over to the Filipinos.
And I regret the lack of foresight on anybody's part to bring some of those boats, which were in really fine condition, back to the States as museum pieces, but none of them were brought back for that reason.
While this seems a terrible waste, it only underscores that, to the Navy, the boats were indeed expendable. So when the men learned that there was a PT boat in San Francisco available for sale, they headed south to investigate.
We went down, and lo and behold, boats in the water. Hey, wow. Well, how much do you want? You can have the boat for $20,000, and we ain't got $20,000. So we left and come back. I get a call in August of '92, and he said, John, you can have the boat. Why? It was on a little dock, and the man that owned it went bankrupt. The guy that bought it told Orlando Brown, get your boat off of there. You can have the boat. You couldn't believe it.
PT 658 was built by Higgins Industries in early 1945 as part of the Lend-Lease program with the Soviet Union. However, when the war ended, before she could be put into service, she was decommissioned and sold at auction. She would spend the next 40 years in the San Francisco Bay, used variously as a commercial trawler, short hauler, and sometime runabout. Each incarnation left PT 658 with a little less of her original equipment and purpose.
He had taken the engines out and put in 671 diesels. There were no guns aboard. They had a couple of auxiliary generators. They had the original battery banks. It had the mufflers on the outside, but it didn't have the exhaust stacks from the engine to the mufflers. And there was some radio gear, I think, in there. But that's about all.
The veterans would make over 12 trips to the Bay Area during the next 18 months to work on the boat and to make arrangements to move her to Portland. Little did they know that it was only the beginning of a quest that would last for more than a decade. Though PT 658 was fundamentally sound, a great deal of work was necessary prior to the move to Portland. The hull was painted above the waterline, the deck covered to prevent further weather damage, and the fuel tanks pumped out.
We had tried to get rid of it. We hoped we could sell it because we were short of cash. And the last day we were there, we were going to have to leave to come back. Some guy drove up in a big tanker, and he pulled it all out for us. We said, what'll you give us for it? And he said, how much will you give me to take it? So we knew we'd had it then. So anyway, we'd get up at 4 and we'd do whatever we had to do till, say, 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon when basically the base closed down. Then we'd go up the room and pull out the Jack Daniels and sit there until time to go to dinner, and then we'd go out to dinner and come back and talk till about midnight, then get up the next day and do the same thing. But it was just a very get acquainted time. And We made some great friendships here now.
Like the veterans restoring PT-658, the crews that served on torpedo boats were a tight-knit unit.
The camaraderie of the guys that are working on this boat is quite similar to the camaraderie we had on our boat.
Most of the guys I had were real dedicated and real hard-working guys, and they'd do anything, you know. It wasn't a case where this is my job and then it's yours. If you needed a hand, you got it.
You knew everybody and knew everything about them, and we were friends.
The myth persists that most PT crewmen were volunteers, attracted by the independence and freedom, and while the speed and firepower of the agile craft appealed to many young recruits, and there were volunteers, most crewmen were draftees with little or no experience on small boats. They soon learned about teamwork and seamanship.
I wasn't too much for a lot of uniform and discipline and muster here and muster there, and I thought if I got to the PT boats where it would be a small crew and seemed to have more excitement to it and a greater chance of fighting in the war, I thought that was the thing I wanted to do.
I saw a movie of a PT boat in New York Harbor going at warp speed, you know, and the flags are flying. I thought, oh, that's for me. That's what I want. And even when we were in training, we thought we would just, the cat's me out. There was nothing better than us guys. We were going to knock out battleships or whatever got in the way because we were faster and smarter and all of those things that young people think they are.
The popular image of PT boats charging full tilt into combat against tremendous odds was in part due to the popularity of the book and later the movie They Were Expendable, which lionized the exploits of Squadron 3 in the Philippines. The dramatic stories of those early days of the war were welcomed by a nation eager for avenging heroes. Myths and misconceptions circulated by newsreels and the press only added to the fascination with PT boats.
Of course, our fleet was decimated at Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese were taking islands all over the Pacific. We needed something that could be built in a hurry in order to fight the Japs as best we could until our fleet was repaired and expanded.
Often referred to as plywood wonders, PT boats were in fact made almost entirely of much heavier material. While it is true that some plywood was used during construction, PT hulls consisted of double-planked mahogany laid over laminated wood frames. This construction technique resulted in an inexpensive, lightweight hull, strong and resilient enough to withstand heavy seas.
When we say the PT boat was cheap, that's absolutely true, but only in an absolute sense, the PT boat being far cheaper than the smallest destroyer escort. But in fact, foot per foot, they were fairly expensive because, being made of mahogany and teak, they were pretty costly. But one advantage was they could be built in boat building yards by yacht builders who couldn't build a destroyer.
Below decks, PT boats carried three 12-cylinder Packard engines.
They were 1,250 horsepower, and then they had supercharged on them, and by increasing the speed of the supercharger, they managed to soup the engines up until eventually they got them up to almost 1,800 horsepower.
I worked in the engine room on the boat. With all three of them, you couldn't hear yourself think in there. And no earmuffs. They didn't know about earmuffs then. And we didn't have brains enough to use them if we had them.
Though incapable of the 50 and even 60 knots reported by the press, PTs could top 40 knots under favorable conditions.
At the time that the PTs were in service, they were the fastest boats on the water. In fact, one evening, it just happened that a convoy was leaving Morotai to go north toward Japan. And just for the devilment of it, this other boat and ours ran a circle around every boat in the convoy as we were going out on patrol.
It's a thrilling thing to have a boat that can go 42 knots, and with the mufflers off, there's a great roar in a PT boat.
Manned by 2 officers and up to 14 enlisted men, PT boats brought more firepower to bear in proportion to their size than any other ship in the U.S. Navy. Early PTs carried 4 torpedoes in tubes and 2 aircraft-type turrets for twin 50-caliber machine guns. Electrically powered, they proved too restrictive and were later replaced by open machine gun mounts. Forward of the bridge were 2 mountings for 30-caliber Lewis machine guns. But it was the torpedoes which gave PTs their most potent and, unfortunately, most problematic weapon.
At the time, we had the old Mark 8 torpedoes. They're from World War I, as a matter of fact. They're terrible things.
68% of the torpedoes in World War II were no good. They either went beneath the target or were duds.
We had a lot of problems with torpedoes early part of the war. They were very erratic.
One of our boats fired a torpedo and something went wrong with it, and it started circling. And they had a hell of a time dodging it because it was armed and live. And it had run for a hell of a long time.
We had a very rudimentary torpedo director, so it was a difficult thing. You almost did it by eye.
Those old torpedoes, they had tubes, and a 3-inch cartridge was in an exploder up above. You could even fire them on a hand, or the guy could push a button in the bridge and fire them.
And the torpedo would come out, and the black powder charge would come out in a big flame. And so at night, why, your position was given away immediately.
You turn around and run like hell then.
Though formidably armed, it was a PT boat's combination of speed and maneuverability that proved to be its most significant assets during the first bitter campaigns in the Pacific. Early in the war, in the waters off Guadalcanal, the U.S. and Japanese fleets faced off in a series of epic battles. Marines of the 1st Division had landed there in August 1942, and Japanese attempts to dislodge them grew in scale and intensity over the next several months. During the day, the U.S. dominated the seas within the Solomons, but nights belonged to the Japanese, who were far superior in terms of the number of ships available. Although Allied forces sailed for battle whenever a major assault threatened, Japanese warships were often unopposed as they shelled the Marines on Guadalcanal. Beginning in early October, PT boats began nightly patrols to help even the odds.
We went out one night, and I looked up, and across the horizon there in the darkness, you could see the outlines of a destroyer going by. His guns were trained 4.5, and I could see guys walking along the deck. And searchlights started coming on. 5 searchlights. We was like we were on the stage. Very hairy. I was on the machine gun at that time, and I fired 370 some odd rounds, 50 calibers in searchlights. We put out 3, so I know I killed a few Japs because they had crews up there manning those searchlights. And one of the destroyers turned, and he was coming right up on our tail, and the gunner's mate went aft. We had 8 depth charges. He rolled off 7 of them, and they went in the water, and I think they forced him to turn aside. And after we got away from that area, I got out and went down forward and looked, and half our bow was blown away.
Hair-raising encounters between PTs and the Tokyo Express were common off Guadalcanal for the next 4 months. Operating almost exclusively in the dead of night, PT crews fought a constant battle not only with the Japanese, but also with fatigue.
You just go out, come back, and you were just about half asleep or half dead all the time because you were working hard. And sometimes you wouldn't get any sleep for 24 hours.
I think a lot of our energy and time and concern centered around taking care of that damn boat, because if we didn't, it wouldn't take care of us.
After a night on patrol, crewmen would spend the day in their base camps maintaining the boat's engines and guns, performing needed repairs, and trying to get a little food and rest before nightfall and the next patrol assignment.
What we did was we'd park them back up in the stream, and our tender was back up in there too, and they put a net over it, and they'd put brush over it to hide it. And I can still remember working on those engines down below. You'd wear shorts, and that's all, skivvy shorts. And the water just run off you because it's so hot.
It's pretty amazing that some of those guys like Jim and Don and Ken kept those engines running, because they were really, the fuel was so bad, you know. They had to chamois skin all that fuel. Can you imagine doing 3,000 gallons a day, trying to run them all through chamois so you could have clean fuel.
They brought in a floating dry dock for replacing the screws and the struts, because before that you put a diving outfit on and get down underneath, replace the struts and the propellers and stuff when you run over a reef. We've learned where most of them were because they ground off of boats pretty bad.
The difficulties encountered by PT crewmen during the war were not unlike the problems that the men of Save the Boat Incorporated would endure. Just as unmarked reefs claim the unwary, an unexpected storm in February 1994 nearly doomed PT 658.
A hell of a storm had come up and tore the boat loose from the dock that it was tied at, and there was a rock levee right along there. The boat swung around and jammed the starboard rudder up through the bottom, and it sank. So they pumped it out and put it on the beach.
When the vets arrived, they found that the buoyancy of the empty fuel tanks had actually kept the boat from sinking completely. They hurriedly applied a wet patch to the hull, reinforced it from the inside, and prayed it would hold.
We stood watches for 4 days till we could get the crane down there, and we'd stand 4-hour watches, 2 guys on each watch. And we did that for 3 days. So it was, those were fun trips.
Their vigilance was rewarded when the boat was successfully towed back to the dock. From there, PT 658 was guided onto a cradle and lifted onto the transport that would carry it on its journey north. The cradle itself was a relic and the only remaining example of the cradles used to transport PTs into combat. Back in Portland, steady progress had been made in preparation for the arrival of the boat, and the men of Save the Boat were eager to get started. On September 29th, PT Boat 658 arrived at its new home. Once she had been transferred to an awaiting barge, 658 was moved to the Marine Reserve Center on Swan Island in the Willamette River, within sight of downtown Portland. With PT 658 in her berth at Swan Island, the painstaking work to restore the boat to its original condition could begin in earnest. The copper sheathing that had been applied to the hull by her first owner was stripped away, revealing extensive damage to the original wooden planking. Macmillan Bladel Limited of Canada stepped up and donated the lumber to repair the hull. The ruined planking was replaced with a layer of 1/4 inch plank, plus a layer of Canadian cypress, 3/4 inch thick and 7 inches wide, just as the originals were. The new material was securely fastened with hundreds of 2.5 inch stainless steel screws. The deck was in bad repair in many spots, and the damaged plywood was replaced with 2 layers of 1/2 inch marine ply with a layer of water shield in between. The chart house was rebuilt and the gearbox hooked up to the helm. Below decks, the crew's quarters, officer's stateroom, and the heads were refurbished. The corroded aluminum was replaced with plywood painted white. The stern of the boat was removed, revealing the lazarette, which houses the rudder drive. At the time of the beaching of the boat at Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, a rudder post had been driven through the hull. The hull was patched, and the rudder housings and posts were repaired. As the work progressed, many of the vets reminisced about the shipbuilding that had taken place just across the way during the war.
America, traditionally a maritime nation, mobilizes its mechanical and its industrial genius to build the largest fleet of cargo ships ever to sail the 7 seas.
From West Coast shipyards such as the one in Portland, hundreds of military transports slid down the ways in an awesome display of American industrial might. No one could have guessed before the war that such vast numbers of ships would ever be necessary. Similarly, it was not until the eve of World War II that the U.S. Navy saw the need for a fast patrol boat.
We started building PT boats the way Americans would recognize them in the late 1930s. And we did that because we saw how motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats were being developed in Europe. The British and the Germans had motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats, but not an awful lot because the British, like us, were a blue water navy with global responsibilities. But unlike us, they had an enemy close at hand, so they had a need for what they called light forces.
When Japanese expansion in the Far East began to threaten the U.S.-controlled Philippine Islands, a crash program was begun to develop a motor torpedo boat. 4 designs, ranging from 54 to 81 feet, were selected for construction, but for a variety of reasons, none proved satisfactory. Fortunately, a promising British design did exist, and in 1939, the Electric Boat Company, or ELCO, secured the rights to manufacture the boat in the United States. The first production run was completed and deployed for testing in the summer of 1940.
They were a little smaller than the regular PT boats. Had 2 turrets on each side and these machine guns, and 3 Packard engines. And you had torpedoes on and all the armament and a full tank of gas. Why, 45, 50 is about the best you could do, which is pretty good in a boat.
Testing revealed several structural deficiencies in the British design, and it also became obvious that the 70-foot boat was ill-suited to carry larger U.S. torpedoes. ELCO enlarged its original design from 70 to 77 feet for the second production run. While ELCO was making these 77-foot craft, 2 other boat builders went to work at their own expense to compete with ELCO. The Higgins Boat Company developed a 76-foot boat, while Huckins Yacht Works settled on a 78-foot design. In the summer of 1941, sea trials were held to determine which design was superior. The test quickly developed into a race that has become known as the Plywood Derby. While an ELCO boat was fastest and had the driest ride, the Higgins entry was only slightly slower and had a better turning radius. Only the Huckins design proved to be a disappointment. After the results of the sea trials were reviewed, ELCO was awarded a contract for 36 boats, now redesigned to 80 feet, while Higgins received a contract for 24 boats. To the men who served aboard them, there was great loyalty to their particular craft. To this day, PTers argue the merits of ELCO versus Higgins.
At reunions, I would ask people, which one do you think was the best? Well, it depended a lot on if you were only on a Higgins or only on an ELCO. Well, since they didn't have the experience with the other kind, how can they say, oh, it's the best boat? The end result is they were equal.
Though there were undeniable differences between the 2 types, all PT boats had one thing in common. They were equipped with 3 enormous Packard engines. However, the engines that would eventually power PT 658 required a great deal of rebuilding. Fortunately, Ken Nissen and Don Brandt, both mechanics during World War II, were up to the task.
I served on the PT boat in South Pacific for a year. I worked in the engine room on the boat, so naturally I got stuck with this job. Or I volunteered, really. Nobody sticks anybody with anything here. They just do what they can do.
They're aircraft-type engines. They're developed from the old Liberty engine, World War I and up to the 30s. Developed by Gar Wood for his Miss Americas.
In July 2003, nearly 9 years after PT 658 had first arrived in Portland, the engine room was ready to receive the reconditioned Packards. The barge holding PT 658 on her cradle was moved by tugboat alongside the engine shed on the dock. The Marines provided the crane, and the engines, each weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, were hoisted through the hatch and placed alongside one another in the boat.
Most of the guys working down there were over 75, some of them over 80 years old, but they did yeoman service, and we got some good help from our volunteers. But we feel great. Just this is the biggest chunk of progress we've made that we can measure today.
Anytime you're moving those engines around, there's always an element of anxiety as far as getting somebody hurt, and always glad to have the final report that job complete, no casualties. That's the main crux.
As the veterans continued to work in the engine room, other aspects of the restoration were going ahead full steam. The original electrical and fire suppression systems had to be removed and retrofitted, and with the help of volunteers, the miles of electrical wire and conduit were replaced. Newly created panels complemented original instruments and gauges. The engine room began to take shape with newly installed exhaust and water intake lines. Custom-fashioned copper hardware added a degree of gleaming elegance to the great Packard engines. The fire suppression in the engine room and aft was installed, and with work above decks proceeding apace, PT-658 was beginning to look like the seaworthy craft she had once been. But to make the transformation to a warship complete, she needed a full complement of weapons. 50 caliber machine guns, 40 and 37 millimeter cannons, depth charges, a smoke generator, and torpedoes had to be located and restored, or if necessary, recreated from scratch. Although PT boats fired countless torpedoes at Japanese warships during the campaign to secure the Lower Solomons, by early 1943, PTs saw their tactical role begin to change. 600 miles west of Guadalcanal, Japanese and Allied forces were locked in a struggle to secure New Guinea. The Japanese garrison there were utterly dependent on supplies flowing in from the Admiralty Islands and Rabaul. Interdiction of those supply lines called for warships, but navigational hazards along New Guinea's coast posed a serious threat to large displacement vessels.
The American Navy loved to close with, engage, and destroy Japanese cruisers and destroyers, but not when there's shoal water 500 yards to either side. Yes, they wanted to fight the Japanese, but they wanted some elbow room. The PT boats didn't care about elbow room.
We could get in, and we weren't afraid to go in. And I think they were very effective, especially in the New Guinea area, because if they'd have been allowed to move freely, why, we wouldn't have had a chance. They just had too many men.
But supplying those men scattered along some 1,500 miles of the New Guinea coast presented a formidable problem, especially in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. In March 1943, a Japanese supply convoy bound from Rabaul to Leh was virtually destroyed by Allied air power. Over 2 days, the Japanese lost 8 transports and 4 destroyers in daylight air attacks. In the aftermath, the Japanese began employing barges, which could more easily hide during daylight hours as their primary means of supply.
There were no roads in New Guinea, so all of their transportation to move their troops down to Wewak and back were by these barges. And they'd have 4, 6, or 8 barges lined up making the traffic, and they couldn't do it in the daytime because the airplanes were patrolling, so they were doing it at night. So that's where we got our reputation as barge killers.
At first it was duck soup, no problem. The Japs got smart, so they put armor on them, and they put bigger guns on them, and so they were fighting back at us.
Japanese barges were armed with automatic light cannon and machine guns, and arranged so that the troops being carried could bring their small arms to bear if attacked. Too small to merit a torpedo, PTs learned that the best way to handle barges was to hit them as fast and hard as possible, then retire before the Japanese could respond.
We'd leave late afternoon, so that just about twilight time, we'd be on station, which would give us the cover of darkness to help. You could pick them up and they didn't even know you were there. So you'd suddenly come swooping in on them, guns a-blazing. So we had that to rely on. We had the firepower, we had the speed, so we'd use it.
A PT was full of 3,000 gallons of 100-octane gasoline, and it's not a very comfortable feeling to get in machine gun fighting in an 80-foot wooden vessel with 3,000 gallons of 100-octane gasoline and no protection around those tanks. But it had to be done.
Though these hit-and-run attacks were moderately successful, they were extremely hazardous, and it was clear that in its role as a barge buster, PTs lacked firepower. Rather than wait for help to arrive in the form of new boats from the States, PT crewmen took matters into their own hands.
The PT boaters, who should have been known as the pirates of the sea instead of the knights of the sea, put a 40 millimeter on the boats, which had been borrowed from the Army in the Solomon Islands and in New Guinea. So the idea got back to the Navy, and they started they made the change and put the 40 millimeter on.
We got our 37 millimeters was from crashed P-39s. This wasn't a very good airplane because they gave a lot of them away to the Australians.
We evolved from a torpedo boat to a gunboat.
We had so much firepower in that thing that I sometimes thought it was going to shake that boat apart, kick in different directions.
By 1944, a typical PT boat carried 2 to 4 torpedoes, 2 dual 50 caliber machine guns in the turrets, a 40mm cannon mounted aft, a 37mm cannon forward, and 2 multiple 5-inch rocket launchers. Thus armed, PT boats in the South Pacific took an ever-mounting toll on Japanese supply ships and barges.
Ultimately, the Japanese were unable to use barges, or use them only at very high risk, losing hundreds of men in an evening with a single barge sinking, done by one PT boat with a crew of perhaps 10 or 12 men. So the Japanese would start transporting supplies by destroyers. So effectively, the Japanese found themselves using their destroyers in a way in which they hadn't expected. They saw their destroyers, as every Navy does, as escorting large ships, as making daring torpedo attacks against capital ships, but they were obliged to use them against swarms of, to them, pestilential shallow draft raiders who would sneak up against them in the darkness, hugging the coastlines.
Meanwhile, American PT squadrons in the Mediterranean and the Aleutians were fighting decidedly different foes.
The folks in Europe had to face a very competent force of Italian and German fast attack craft. The Germans called them Schnellboot, fast boat. The British would call them E-boats for enemy boats. And these had internal torpedo tubes, nice big healthy torpedoes, and the Italians had remarkably fast craft.
At the time, the Germans had what they call an E-boat, which is about a 110-footer. It was powered by 3 diesels, and it was bigger and faster than us, but not as maneuverable. But they had heavier armament, so we had a problem with them. They also had what they call F-lighters, which are like a barge, a fast barge, and they used that to transport material and the like. And we had some problems with them.
Although the flak barges and E-boats encountered in the Mediterranean provided formidable opposition, it was the men unfortunate enough to serve in the Aleutians who faced the war's most implacable adversary, the weather.
I never could figure out what the hell they sent PT boats up there for. I mean, my God, sometimes you're going over 1 and under 2 as far as waves are concerned. They're so damn high, you can't see where the hell you're going. You couldn't launch torpedoes off the darn boat. What are you going to shoot at? You know, for that kind of weather to send these kind of boats up there, because it just played hell with the boats. All I was doing, being a carpenter's mate, was repairing the boats for gashes and having the gunnels that are all wrecked up there from banging against things, and holes all punched in the side. And it was really a mess.
Far from the Aleutians and the storm-swept memories of Vern Carlson, the men of Save the Boat Incorporated had reached a crucial and controversial stage in the restoration. After countless hours of caulking and sanding, the hull was at last ready to be sealed. It was decided that an innovative coating of truck bed liner material be used.
You can see how it just fills in all the cracks, and this will be watertight for years and years. It's a pretty good product, so I think it will be watertight. Which is very important, because we don't want to put it in the water and have it sink.
However, a major setback occurred when the caulking and liner materials proved incompatible. There was no choice but to strip the newly finished caulking. It was several weeks before the hull was recaulked and sealed, and painting could at last begin. Although they had hoped to have PT-658 in the water by the fall of 2003, the time lost due to the caulking snafu made that desire impractical. It was decided to use the winter months to fine-tune the electrical and mechanical systems in preparation for a spring launch. The dream of cruising the waters of the Columbia and Willamette Rivers seemed within reach. But on October 2, 2003, the phone rang in Harry Whittemeyer's house at 9 p.m. in the evening.
The watch told me that your boat's on fire and there's 9 units here. And I said, can you tell me any more, you know, how bad is it? And he says, no, sir, all I know is what I'm telling you.
A fire caused $100,000 worth of damage to a rare World War II-era patrol torpedo boat moored near Swan Island. KPTV's Marilyn Deutsch has the story.
Today, fire investigators and veterans surveyed the damage from a blaze sparked by a short in the PT boat's electrical panel.
There's some hull damage, some structural hull damage, but it's not unrepairable.
Still, it is a setback for these veterans who've worked for a dozen years restoring the boat, hoping to actually get it running again.
Although the quick response of Portland fire crews limited the damage, the fire had burned through the deck and gutted the stateroom.
Smoldered for a while, and then when it lit off, it must have lit off with a pretty good impact because it blew the hatch off, and the fire, you can see how the fire sort of scorched up the bulkhead there. But believe me, over the years we've been working on this thing, we've had other setbacks that are every bit as serious as this is, and I'm just delighted that it's practically the smallest compartment on board the boat that could take the damage.
So what do you think? I think we got a hell of a job. We got a guy coming that's supposed to be an expert on boat building Monday to kind of give us an appraisal.
It'll hold us back a month or two. It's when we get it all finished, we're going to be experts at repairing PT boats.
But it isn't anything that we can't handle and we can't get done, and we will. We've faced tougher stuff before and gotten through it.
While it was too early to know the full extent of the damage, the ability of the veterans to accept this latest setback was remarkable. They had been through tough times before, and perhaps it was their shared experiences during both the restoration and the war that allowed them to carry on regardless.
The service on the PTs was different. We lived different. Every island was different, and you had to fashion your operation accordingly. Normally in the military, you get a lot of written instructions. We didn't have any. Left it up to us to figure out what to do and how to do it. So we were not totally freelancers, but almost.
PT boats were typified by the title of the book. They were expendable. They were wooden boats with steel men, and they frequently got in harm's way. A number of boats were destroyed, I don't know how many, but they were very successful in their mission.
We just had orders out there in the water to, if it's floating, sink it. Canoes, coconuts, whatever. And at nighttime you didn't really look to see what it was anyhow. There was just something out there.
Because it was pitch black. You know, you couldn't see from here to you.
Dark comes down like a curtain in the Pacific, but we had a channel that wasn't all that easy to get in and out of. You wouldn't want to do that in the dark. So we left in the daylight, last of the daylight pretty much.
Go down 3 or 4 miles, test fire our weapons, then we'd run down to the patrol area. Somebody estimated that we drew enemy fire in about 65% of the patrols that we were on.
Some nights we'd just patrol 2 or 3 miles off the island back and forth, and some nights might go out 50, 60 miles up toward Tarawa. And every once in a while, we'd luck out and we'd get to go up some of the other islands. A couple of my favorites were Nuki Vitao and Nuki Lele. They were friendly natives, and the name was intriguing, but it didn't pan out.
Then we'd go along the beaches, very close in. Occasionally somebody'd run ashore, and we'd look for barges.
The minute you encountered barges, they'd head for shore if they could. So our deal was try to be so close to shore that they would keep them to the seaside, so they couldn't escape us. We could get at them.
So you'd be out there, and first thing you'd know, you'd hear a noise alongside. You'd think it was another boat, and it'd be a Japanese barge.
About the time we got to the guns, usually they were on us.
So you'd fire, and you'd find out there were 3 or 4 of them there, and they'd either have troops or equipment on them.
Some of them are just little guys, and they don't have much in the way of firepower, but this son of a gun had plenty. Those little green and orange things start flying at you pretty thick.
And if they weren't out in the water, why, we'd see them on the beach. And if somebody thought they spotted something, why, we'd fire off a flare, see what was in there. Sometimes we'd get a lot of return fire because there were a lot of guns and a lot of Japanese down there. And they got the smart idea, they'd bring one barge out, and if you chased it, to get in, then they'd have the shore batteries ringed all around them, and all hell break loose.
There was a hell of a lot of times you're scared to death, there's no question about it. But most of the time was afterwards when you thought about what could happen. When you're in combat, you're pretty damn busy. You really are. And especially on a small craft where everyone depends upon the other person, very much so. So you're not only looking out for yourself, but you're looking out for your buddy and making sure that he's okay. And that the boat's okay, because that's the center of our life.
Generally, we had good communication and good rapport with the Air Corps, whether it was Marines, Navy, Army, whatever. But occasionally somebody would get a itchy finger and they'd see a boat on the water and they'd just take off after. It didn't make any difference if we had an American flag on it or not.
There wasn't much air power up in the Topi, but then we got the Philippines, there was a lot of it. And they would come down and catch you out on patrol while they'd work you over pretty good.
I guess it was a Zero that was making a run on us, and of course they knew when I saw him coming that he was set up for a suicide hit on the boat. The skipper was at the wheel of the boat, and I think that he had just started to turn the boat to maneuver out of the path of the plane, but he didn't get the boat moved before it hit. The effect that it had on the bow of the boat was like a catapult. The gun loader and myself, and also the gunner on the 20 millimeter, were all catapulted up in the air. I'm not sure how high in the air that it went, but it was far enough that I had time to look down and see the wreckage of the boat. And my concern was whether I was going to land in the water or hit on some of that wreckage, but I missed the wreckage.
You never forget hearing men yelling in the water. They don't know whether there's a shark there, they don't know if there's somebody wounded. You just...
You begin to figure, after all those battles, that your odds of continuing are getting slimmer. Percentages.
Certainly had my hat off to the PT boaters who had longer service than I, because theirs was some of the roughest duty during the war. But one thing about PT boaters is that they all seem to love the boats, and I sure do too. And that's exemplified by the fact that there are a dozen or so World War II PT boaters who are now trying to restore this boat, and our dream is to get it in the water this summer if at all possible.
But before that dream could be realized, an enormous amount of work would be required to repair the damage done by the fire. The first task was to begin the hard and dirty work of clearing the debris. The pilot house was moved forward to allow access below deck, and engineers were called in to assess the full extent of the damage. The fire, which started in the officers' quarters, spread to the port bulkhead and into the superstructure, where it destroyed or compromised several ribs and deck support beams. There had also been significant damage to the cabin walls and flooring, much of which would need to be gutted before the repairs could begin. If there was a bright spot, it was that the engine room had been spared.
It's going to be a job to rebuild this thing a lot more than I thought at first. There's more damage in it.
As the extent of the fire damage came to light, it was clear that the enthusiasm and will of the veterans was going to be severely tested. Word of the fire spread to the community, and the response was immediate. Many volunteered their time, money, or both to help, just as so many others had in the past.
And that's what is keeping us alive. $10 here, $25 there, once in a while a $100 check. When they find out what we're trying to do, we've had people volunteer who are professionals. They can be an electrician or whatever. They want to see that boat in the water running.
Throughout the restoration, the small band of PT veterans had been assisted by a diverse group of volunteers, many of whom brought with them much needed skills. But they all brought something else too, something even more important. They brought needed enthusiasm and a passion for the project, which came to match that of the vets themselves.
And about 3 years ago, my mother wrote an article in the paper about the PT boat being redone down at Swan Island here. And so I just wanted to come down and have a look. And I just felt a real connection with it from what my father had told me. And I just started volunteering whenever I had time. And it's just been a great experience.
It's really interesting for me because I'm a history buff, so I kind of am enjoying learning all this stuff that I never knew about, these wooden boats, you know. It's just been a lot of fun being around them and working on this piece of living history.
I've in some ways become part of the boys, and they welcome me, and they are just such compassionate, generous men. I'm a history teacher by trade, and so it's incredible to see history through their eyes and through their lifetimes.
World War II was the largest armed conflict in history, and winning it required the concerted efforts of millions who were willing to set aside personal ambition for the common good. Everyone played a part, whether at home or overseas, and during the long and arduous climb through the Solomon Islands and up the coast of New Guinea, PTers had played their role well. The combined efforts of the Navy, Army, Air Corps, and Marines had relentlessly pushed the Japanese back toward their home islands.
The plan that MacArthur had devised was to get these Japanese groups on these islands, subdue them, surround them, and leave them there. Move on to the next island.
From a PT boat's point of view, these are actually stepping stones. I can help the air-land team use trifibious forces, ships, aircraft, and land units to seize an island, and then it becomes an air base and an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the aviators. It becomes a resupply point and staging area for the ground troops for their next assault, and it becomes my base. So I don't have to operate 500 miles at night. I can operate 200 miles away from my base.
Then our job was to police it, make sure they didn't run more people in, people out, supplies in. So that's what we did.
There just wasn't anybody else to do it. And I think they were effective all over because the Japanese did not like the PT boats.
Japanese called the PTs devil boats. They were always creating all kinds of problems for them. So whenever you talked to them about it, well, that's a devil boat, they didn't like it.
By October 1944, the United States was poised to regain the Philippines. The Japanese command knew that if the Philippine Islands were lost, so too was the war. Their plan to halt the inevitable led to the Battle for Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in modern history. Comprised of 4 separate actions, PT boats played a significant role at the Battle of Surigao Straits.
Well, there was probably about 40 PT boats that were stationed at various locations on either side of those straits. The PT boats were sent out to make the first contact and observation of the Jap ships coming in.
Our instructions were to radio in when we saw the enemy.
And actually it was our boat, the 127, that radioed back to fleet headquarters where the Japanese were exactly and so forth.
A couple of destroyers showed up. It was very dark, and we could see them on our radar, and we went out to attack them.
We had an executive officer named Bill Stewart, and Bill was right there at the wheel, and I was at the 50, and he said, "Well, Bruck, let's go get them."
We got 2 torpedoes off, and we ran into a rain squall. Couldn't see anything.
Except for flashes of gunfire going off. Big flash in the sky, tracer bullets.
You know, like a 4th of July celebration. The red-hot projectiles going back and forth.
And it was scary. You think that you might get frightened, but to get really scared takes time. And not ashamed to say that I was scared before that battle was over.
We spent a very nervous night. We didn't know who'd won. whether we had a place to go back to. They told us that we'd have scored a big victory. The Japanese lost nearly everything that came up the strait at us.
As a result of the battle for Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist, yet it was more than 9 months before the U.S. fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay to accept the Japanese surrender. Ironically, of the 253 Allied ships present, not even one was a PT.
PT boats didn't rank very high in the Navy, you know, but that's all right.
After 60 years, the men's affection for PT boats remains unchanged, evident in their determination to see the restoration through. By 2003, veterans Jim Brunette, Bob Hostetler, Al McCready, Frank Lesage, Harry Wiedemeyer, Rolf Bruckner, John Aiken, B.D. Lay, and Russ Hamachek had worked diligently for more than a decade.
We started working together just like we'd been in the war together. It's the strangest sensation. It's a nice one.
There's been a kind of a closeness. One time a guy asked, or he said, you know, we could have made a real good crew in World War II. And I tell him, hey, we are a good crew.
But time had taken its toll on the ranks of Save the PT Boat Incorporated. Al McCready, PT boat crewman, editor of the Oregonian for many years and one of the original members of the group, died on June 30th, 2003. He was preceded on his last patrol, as PT boaters like to say, by a dedicated group of veterans: Brian Larson, Claire Brown, Don Carter, Dwayne Craigrud, Jesse Sohn, and Kenneth Morris were early and avid supporters of the effort to restore PT 658. Their energy and hard work were missed. Spurred on by the passing of time and a new sense of urgency, efforts were redoubled and plans for a June launch were made. Through the winter and early spring of 2004, charred beams, bulkheads, and other structures were repaired or removed and replaced, while virtually the entire boat was sanded and painted. It was with a collective sigh of relief that the deck was finally replaced and the pilot house returned to its position. The canvas awning, in place for nearly 10 years, was stripped away, and PT 658 was at last open to the sun. In final preparation, Al McCready's daughter, Molly, proudly completed the painting of the transom. After 12 long years, PT 658 was at last ready to be launched. Just after dawn, on the morning of June 7, 2004, just one day after the 60th anniversary of the Normandy invasion, and 1 week after the dedication of the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., the veterans of Save the PT Boat Incorporated gathered on the dock at Swan Island. As volunteers and friends watched from the dock and from small ships, a tug nosed against the barge holding PT 658 and slowly moved her into the channel for the trip across the inlet. Dwarfed by massive cranes and flanked by a cruise ship and a U.S. Navy magazine boat, the barge carrying PT 658 was gently moved into position. Longshoremen attached slings to the cradle, and in moments, PT 658 was hoisted over the side and into the water for her return trip to Swan Island and the last stages of her restoration. The launching of PT 658 was a great accomplishment for the veterans, volunteers, and supporters, but there was still more to be done. After a fresh coat of deck paint, the 50 caliber guns were installed on their mounts in the gun tubs port and starboard of the wheelhouse, and the torpedoes and depth charges were secured amidships. With almost all of her armament in place, PT 658 was beginning to look more like a gunship than a light, fast torpedo boat.
going to shoot down at least 3 zeros today.
A state-of-the-art navigation system was installed on the bridge, including radar and Loran. In the engine compartment, the vets and volunteers worked tirelessly to coax the massive Packards to life. A hydraulic throttle system was put in place, allowing the helmsman to control all 3 engines from the bridge, and after many trials and much fine-tuning, PT-658 was ready for her long-awaited maiden voyage.
Welcome back. You just sort of feel like you're 18 again. You know what I mean?
As with any boat, PT-658 shakedown cruise revealed some problems. The carburetors and exhaust needed work, but the problems were minor compared to what the men had been through previously. By June, more than 60 years after her keel was laid, PT-658 was ready for her christening.
Local veterans came to dedicate the world's first fully restored and operational U.S. Navy motor torpedo boat.
I suspect each one of us had his own reasons. Relive his youth, hear those 3 big Packards roar, stand on the deck of a fast-moving boat. Whatever our reasons, we were advised it was an impossible task, that it would never run, much less float. And never tell an old PT boater that it can't be done.
We've been working on this for about 12 years, from stem to stern, from gunnel to gunnel, from deck to keel.
But it's been a heck of a lot of work.
We built the gun tubs, we put the rub rails on, we managed to bring it to completion.
It needs to have a bottle broken over the bow, that's all there is to it.
It's the only one. It means that we have now said to the people, we have a boat, a World War II PT boat.
For PT boaters in the dark of night, in the South Pacific, and enemy territory, in a little wooden boat, that took a lot of guts.
Back in 1963, I had the ambition to take a PT boat up the Willamette River. I thought that would be fun. Well, today I got to do it, and it was a real thrill.
The vision and perseverance of a handful of World War II veterans has given to the city of Portland, the state of Oregon, and the nation a gift that is truly timeless. For future generations, PT-658 will be an invaluable source of historical and maritime history. For those who took part in the war, she will be a reminder of their service and a proud legacy of the fighting men and ships of the Mosquito Fleet.